Hello, this is Group 1 for Business Law. Today we're going to be talking about Gibbons v. Ogden and the federal right to control interstate commerce. The scene, post-revolutionary America, the rivers and bays of New York and New Jersey. In 1808, the state of New York granted a monopoly of navigational privileges for boats powered by fire or steam to Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton. These privileges were applicable to all of the waters within New York's jurisdiction for a period of 30 years. Many competitors attempted to legally challenge Livingston and Fulton's monopoly by citing the federal government's powers to regulate commerce, but they were quickly undercut by takeovers or chose to purchase licenses from Livingston and Fulton after legal battles failed or stalled. One such license purchaser is our defendant. Aaron Ogden of New York, a former revolutionary soldier, lawyer, senator, and governor of New Jersey, entered the steamboat industry in 1811. Offering commercial services between Elizabethtown, New Jersey, New York City, he purchased a 10-year license from Livingston and Fulton to operate steamboats on New York's waterways. Initially, Aaron formed a partnership in this business with our plaintiff. Thomas Gibbons, formerly of Georgia, was a British loyalist who came of age during the Revolutionary War. After being convicted of treason, Gibbons was able to petition for the full rights and privileges of citizenship by 1788, eventually being elected mayor of Savannah in 1791. In 1801, Gibbons moved to New Jersey, purchasing a large dock facility as well as a summer house next door to our defendant, Aaron Ogden. In 1815, Thomas and Ogden formed a partnership in the steamboat business, but after 3 years, after acquiring several of his own steamboats and ferries, Gibbons broke the partnership and began competing against Ogden over the same routes. The issue. In 1820, after the partnership was broken, Ogden filed for an injunction with New York, which was granted, to force Gibbons to cease commercial operation on the jurisdictional waterways of the state. Gibbons then appealed to the Supreme Court, citing the supremacy of his federal licensing over Ogden's state, acquired in accordance with the Coastings Act of 1793.
This brings us to the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, heard by the Supreme Court after the two previous ruled in favor of Ogden. Next slide. Ogden believed that he had a claim that he had a right granted to him by the state of New York to operate exclusively along these waters. This was because he had purchased a franchise from Fulton and Livingston, which allowed him to operate his steamboats on the rivers of New York exclusively. He also said that interstate commerce law should be left up to the states. Gibbons, however, cited the 1793 Act of Congress, which regulated coastal commerce. Accordingly, it would say that he would have the right to also operate on those waters. He believed those steamboats were licensed by federal statute, and that the Commerce Clause gives federal government power over interstate commerce. So the argument that really the Supreme Court had to look at was New York able to regulate commerce within its borders, even if that commerce depended on commerce in other states? This is expressly important because when the court began discussing the meaning of Commerce Clause in 1824, it had become a widespread interest, mainly because of a bill that Congress was debating, providing a federal survey of roads and canals. So in particular, Southerners who were growing more sensitive to these issues of sectional disputes, including slavery, were increasing, so this had a widespread effect. So some of the key points that we want to remember when we look at this is the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2, which states that the state laws must yield to constitutional acts of Congress. This would, if upheld, would strengthen the authority of the federal government. Then also the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce within foreign nations, among the several states, and within the Indian tribes. And the meaning of the word commerce is a sort of controversy in itself, as the Constitution did not explicitly define the word commerce. Some would argue that it refers simply to trade or exchange, while others claim that the framers of the Constitution intended to describe more broadly martial and social intercourse between citizens. The interpretation of commerce affects the appropriate dividing line between federal and state power.
So what was the decision? Unanimous decision from the Supreme Court ruling in favor of Gibbons, stating that Congress alone had the power to regulate interstate and coastal trade. This decision addressed what constituted as commerce and what among the several states meant. Regarding commerce, the court ruled that this is the actual trade of commodities, including commercial transportation. Regarding among the states, it was decided that any activity that intermingled with or in which states have an active interest in the commerce should be considered. So for Gibbons v. Ogden, there's 2 points. Commerce, this includes transportation, and secondly, an expanded role for the federal government. There was no dissenting opinion in Gibbons v. Ogden, which received a unanimous vote of 6-0. Justice Thompson abstained. However, Justice Williams wrote a concurring opinion in order to present points not specifically covered in Marshall's writing. Next slide. Who is Chief Justice John Marshall? Marshall was born in Virginia and had no formal education. He joined the Continental Army and later joined the House of Delegates in 1782. President Washington nominated Marshall as the U.S. Attorney for Virginia, which Marshall declined in favor of pursuing his own law practice. Marshall was pulled back into the political sphere in 1797 by Adams, where Marshall was involved in historic events such as the XYZ affair, the Quasi-War, and eventually the Midnight Judges Act. President Adams appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court after Adams failed to appoint his original pick, John Jay. During Marshall's 34-year tenure as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court would emerge as an important force in the federal government for the first time, and Marshall himself played a major role in shaping the nation's understanding of constitutional law. Previously, each justice would author a separate opinion on each case. Under Marshall, the Supreme Court adopted the practice of handing down a single majority opinion of the court, allowing it to present a clear rule. Marshall leaned heavily on his court, as he did not know the specifics and previous precedents of law to the extent of his colleagues. He is quoted as saying, "There's story. That is the law of the case. Now go and find the authorities." Marshall is our longest serving Supreme Court justice at 34 years. He died in 1835. The Liberty Bell was run following his death. A widespread story claims that this was when the bell cracked, never to be run again. Marshall had been among the last remaining of the founding fathers. Below, you'll find Marshall's court. Specifically, key justices are Joseph Story, William Johnson, and Bushrod Washington. Marshall Court would issue more than 1,000 decisions, about half of which were written by Marshall himself. Marshall's leadership of the Supreme Court ensured that the federal government would exercise relatively strong powers despite the political domination of the Democratic Republicans after 1800. Key cases were Marbury v. Madison, Fletcher v. Peck, McCulloch v. Maryland, Cohens v. Virginia, and Gibbons v. Ogden. The Marshall Court struck down an act of Congress in only one case, Marbury v. Madison in 1803. But that established the court as a center of power that could overrule the Congress, the president, the states, and all lower courts if that is what a fair reading of the Constitution required.
Alrighty, now for the historical importance. As you can see, my artistic ability would have just overwhelmed the world, so I just decided to save the world by becoming a doctor. At the time of Gibbons v. Ogden, our fledgling nation was grappling with this huge power struggle. Each state, who had more or less governed themselves as almost sovereign nations, had committed their resources to each other to form a much larger combined national government to orchestrate standards and facilitate intercourse among the states. For the first time in our young nation's history, Gibbons v. Ogden raised the question of what regulation of commerce would be interpreted to mean to the states and to the federal government. Next slide. The justices made key definitions related to the word commerce and to the phrase among the several states. The unanimous decision provided the foundation for our country's operation and regulation of commerce in almost every facet of our lives. In the next slide, in particular, Chief Justice Marshall interpreted the meaning of the Commerce Clause to give Congress broad power over commercial activity and reduce that of the states. One of Marshall's most provocative quotes is that commerce does not just apply to the buying and selling of goods, but also to the commercial intercourse, quote unquote, which in this case includes navigation. The Chief Justice justified this broad interpretation by examining the original intent of the framers of the Constitution. Marshall noted that all Americans understand the word commerce to include navigation. And it was so understood when the framers wrote the Constitution. Marshall continued to note that one of the, quote, immediate causes leading to the adoption of the Constitution was to allow the federal government to regulate commerce in order to avoid the, quote, embarrassing and destructive consequences of leaving such regulation up to the legislation of so many different states, unquote. This commercial intercourse has come to mean almost every aspect of business and personal interaction among the lives of Americans, to include manufacturing, transportation, point of purchase, the Civil Rights Act, which is anchored in outlawing business discrimination, the Forest Service, which prevents logging, the prevention of physical abuse of women or sick leave and illness, which results in lost productivity, and the Clean Air and Water Acts, which promote public safety and pollution prevention. Finally, on the last slide here, for the first time in our nation's history, the Marshall Court also held up one of the founding principles of the Constitution, that federal powers supersede states' powers. The court determined that the phrase, among the several states, endowed Congress with authority to regulate commerce that may be introduced into the interior. Chief Justice Marshall was careful to note, however, that Congress's power under the Commerce Clause did not extend to the regulation of commercial activity taking wholeheartedly within the state and does not extend to or affect other states. The court's broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause to give Congress great regulatory authority over commercial activity within and between states reinforced our Constitution's Supremacy Clause and expanded the federal government's power over the states. Next slide. And that so concludes our presentation of Gibbons v. Ogden. I want to do a special thanks to Jeff and our classmates.